My wife broke my heart when I saw her get into a strange man's car at the company party. It was an instant, a second frozen in time, but in it my entire reality shattered like broken glass. My body paralyzed, my throat dried up, and my chest was filled with a suffocating emptiness. My heart, until then intact, beat with strength, not because of love, but because of the treacherous blow I had just received. The loud music, the colorful lights, the laughter of the people around, nothing made sense anymore. My world was crumbling before my eyes. Her face illuminated by the reflection of the car dashboard, her lips curving in a smile that was no longer mine. And he, that man I had never seen before, opening the door for her to enter as if it were a rehearsed, intimate gesture, belonging to a hidden routine that I should never have discovered. My fingers balled into involuntary fists as my mind tried to assimilate what I saw. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a misunderstanding. I knew what that meant. It was living evidence that I had been deceived, that every night we lay together, every sweet word whispered in my ear, was a lie. She was no longer mine. Maybe it never would have been. The sound of the engine starting woke me up from my trance. My legs wanted to run there, pull her out of that car, make her face me and answer the questions that were beginning to form in my mind, but my pride spoke louder. No. I wouldn't stop her. I would let her go, because at that moment, my mind was already working on the only thing that could give me back some control, revenge. I didn't just want to confront her. I didn't just want to understand why. I wanted the whole world to know who she really was. I wanted all the eyes that saw us as a perfect couple to know the dirty truth behind appearances. And more than that, I wanted to come out on top. A broken heart would be fuel for something much bigger. Pain would turn into strength. I wouldn't be the silent victim of betrayal, I wouldn't be the betrayed fool who cowers in a corner, suffering in silence. I would make an example of her. And the time for that would come sooner than she could have imagined. My mind went back to every detail of the last few months. Could it be that it was always there and I was blind? Small delays, lame excuses, a detachment that, in retrospect, screamed the truth. I wanted to believe that they were just phases, that every relationship goes through ups and downs. I refused to see the signs because I loved her. Because she was part of my life. Because I didn't want to admit that the woman I built everything with was capable of looking me in the eye and blatantly lying. But now, every shared laugh, every touch, every promise felt like a cruel irony. I mentally relived the countless times I caught her distracted, looking at her phone and smiling. The nights when she seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else. I wondered how many times she had been with him while claiming to be busy with something harmless. How many messages exchanged, how many hidden meetings, how many lies told without hesitation. How many of us had already died before I even realized it? And what hurt me more, was it a sudden decision or a cold, calculated plan? The questions multiplied in my head, but none of that mattered anymore. The truth was already there, out in the open. And what came next would be no ordinary confrontation. I wouldn't call her for a private conversation, I wouldn't let her manipulate me with fake tears or empty promises. I would make that night unforgettable for everyone around us. If she thought she would come out unscathed, she was wrong. The plan began to form in my mind with the clarity of a well-structured chess game. I knew exactly what to do, exactly how to turn the pain that consumed me into an explosion of justice. The company party was still in full swing, and I had a perfect opportunity to turn that event into a milestone. I would announce our divorce in the most epic way possible. I would expose your betrayal with all the evidence I could gather. I would leave her without ground, without defense, without a way out. And more than that, I would make sure no one ever looked at her the same way again. I took out my cell phone and started to act. If it was supposed to be a game, I would play it until the end. I started gathering everything that could be used against her. Suspicious messages, schedules that didn't match up, small pieces of evidence that previously seemed insignificant, but now connected like pieces of a puzzle. I needed to make sure that no one had any doubts about who the real villain in that story was. Time seemed to slow down, as if the universe gave me the space I needed to prepare my final move. My every step was precise, calculated. And when I finally reached the moment to act, my voice sounded firmer than I could have ever imagined. My heart was still in pieces, but my stance was unshakable. I wouldn't beg for explanations. I wouldn't look for answers that wouldn't change anything. I would just show the world who she really was. But there was something I still didn't know. Something that would make everything take on much greater proportions. Something that would make that betrayal even dirtier, even more unforgivable. Something that would change not just how I saw her, but how everyone around us would come to see her. What I was about to discover was worse than I imagined. And when the full truth came out, not even I would be prepared for the impact. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is exposed without filters. Here, we do not and will never support any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the lesson is real. Infidelity destroys lives, corrodes bonds, and always takes its toll. Get ready for an intense story, full of twists and emotions. Take a deep breath, because what comes next will leave you speechless. The night shone with the city lights reflecting on the glass of the large event hall, where the company party brought together employees, directors, and special guests. The atmosphere was relaxed, elegant, filled with the energy of those celebrating achievements and strengthening professional relationships. In the middle of that sophisticated setting, amid laughter and toasts, was Daniel, a man who for years had dedicated his life to work, family and everything he believed to be essential for a solid marriage. He wore an impeccable suit, fitted perfectly to his body, and held a glass of whiskey in his hand, while his eyes roamed the room with the tranquility of someone who felt comfortable there. The ambient music mixed with the buzz of lively conversations, and he, alongside Laura, his wife of more than a decade, shared polite smiles and formal interactions. Laura was the type of woman who attracted attention without having to try. Her black dress molded elegantly to her body, and her hair fell in waves over her shoulders. She had always had a natural charm, a discreet magnetism that made people feel drawn to her presence. She was intelligent, charismatic, and knew exactly how to carry on a conversation, whether at social gatherings or in the workplace. The marriage between her and Daniel had always been admired, seen by many as an example of complicity and partnership. They built a life together based on trust, shared plans and mutual support. At least, that's what Daniel believed. He watched Laura interact with her colleagues, noticed how her laughter echoed between the tables, how her posture radiated security and sophistication. It was fascinating to see her like that, so at ease, as if that environment were her natural habitat. Since she had gotten that promotion at the company, she seemed even more confident, more determined. He was proud of this. He enjoyed seeing her grow professionally, realizing that she was gaining ground on her own merit. But at the same time, something inside him began to change. There was a silent distance between them these days, an empty space he tried to ignore. Little things, like the time she spent on her cell phone before bed, the distracted smiles that seemed lost in distant thoughts, the departures that became more frequent with increasingly vague excuses. He tried to push these thoughts away, convincing himself that it was just a phase, that the stress of work affected any couple's routine. The party continued its course, with toasts and speeches, and Daniel noticed how Laura moved around the room with an almost rehearsed ease. He wondered if at some point she would look for him, if she would try to engage him in a conversation, if she would make some spontaneous gesture that would confirm that they were still the same as before. But she was too busy. With each new group that formed around her, with each new topic that arose, it seemed that he was increasingly left aside. It was strange to feel like an extra in your own story, but maybe it was just an impression. After all, he had never been a man to attract attention, he had always been more discreet, more observant. Maybe this was just another one of those moments when insecurities spoke loudly, and nothing more. He took a sip of the whiskey, feeling the warmth of the alcohol spread down his throat as he looked at Laura from afar. The lights reflected off his skin, and for a moment he allowed himself to remember how it all began. They met at university, young, full of dreams and ambitions. He fell in love with her independent way, the way she faced challenges without hesitation. They built a story based on respect and affection, faced difficulties together, celebrated victories, made plans. Time passed, and love matured, becoming something more stable, more comfortable. There was no longer the overwhelming passion of the beginning, but there was something deeper, something that he thought was unshakable. Until then. That night shouldn't be any different from so many others they spent together. He imagined that they would return home tired, that Laura would perhaps complain about something at the event, that they would talk about trivial things before going to sleep. But there was something in the air that he couldn't explain. And discomfort, a strange sensation that insisted on remaining there. He looked around, trying to find something that would justify that uneasiness. People laughed, talked, toasted. Everything seemed normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It was then that a detail caught his attention. An exchange of glances that lasted too long, a whisper in the ear, a smile that didn't just seem polite. A man he didn't know well, someone who wasn't part of Laura's inner circle, but who was there, close enough for something inside him to set off a silent alarm. He didn't want to seem paranoid, didn't want to make hasty assumptions, but his instinct told him something was wrong. He continued watching, trying to make sense of what he saw. He felt his heart racing, and a knot forming in his stomach. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, when he saw her slowly walk away, without saying anything, without even looking for him, a chill ran down his spine. He dropped the glass on the nearest table and followed her steps with his gaze, feeling the tension increasing with each second. The party continued as if nothing was happening, as if the world was still the same. But for Daniel, everything was starting to fall apart. He didn't know exactly what he was about to discover, but deep down, something told him that that night would change everything. Daniel watched Laura from afar, feeling a cold weight growing in his chest. He tried to ignore the uneasiness, to rationalize what he saw, to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, but something wouldn't allow him to look away. Her gestures were subtle, but they carried a strange familiarity with someone he didn't know. The way he tilted his head slightly while listening, the way he smiled with a different sparkle in his eyes, a reflection of something that seemed to slip through his fingers. There was an invisible gulf between them, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. He closed his hand around the glass, feeling the ice melt against his skin, but the external sensation was nothing compared to the uncomfortable heat rising up his spine. His eyes followed every movement, every exchange of glances that Laura shared with that man. Who was he? A new colleague? Anyone from the board? A client? Daniel searched his memory, but he couldn't match the face to any known name. Maybe it was someone irrelevant, maybe it was all just an exaggeration on his part. But then, he saw the way her eyes met the other man's, and he knew that nothing was as simple as he wanted to believe. He looked around, looking for something to distract him, to make him push away those thoughts, but everything around him seemed distant, disconnected. People were talking, laughing, toasting, and there he was, paralyzed by what he couldn't define as a legitimate fear or just an unfounded suspicion. He decided to act rationally. He took out his cell phone, opened a message to Laura and wrote something simple, casual. He asked her if she wanted them to leave soon or if she preferred to stay a while longer. He wanted to test, see if she would respond quickly, if she would act naturally. Minutes passed. Nothing. He looked up again and no longer saw her in the same place. His heart sped up, his breathing became shallow. He swept his gaze around the room, trying to find her, but she was gone. His body reacted before his mind could order anything, and he began to move around the room, maintaining a casual air, as if he was just circulating. He approached the group Laura had been in moments before and asked one of her colleagues a trivial question, something about the event, some comment. And then, he took the opportunity to release the doubt that was gnawing at him. He asked if anyone knew where Laura was. The man in front of her hesitated for a second, looked to the side, and then replied that she had gone out for a moment, that she needed to sort out something. Daniel thanked him, trying to maintain control, but inside him, a storm was beginning to form. He decided to discreetly leave the room, crossing the corridors of the place, and when he finally arrived outside, his eyes desperately searched for a sign of her. And then he saw it. There was Laura, a few meters away, standing near the entrance, looking around, as if she was waiting for someone. Daniel stood still, watching her. He felt the air escaping his lungs unevenly. He wanted to believe that she was just getting some air, that in moments she would come back inside and find him as if nothing was happening. But then, a black car slowly pulled up to the curb, and he saw how her shoulders relaxed as she recognized who was inside. He held his breath, watching the passenger door open. The man who had been with her at the party came out, took a step towards her, and then, without hesitation, Laura smiled and walked towards him. Daniel felt the ground open beneath his feet. It was a different smile. It was not a smile of courtesy, of friendship, of mere sympathy. It was an intimate smile, filled with a meaning he didn't want to understand. And then, as if time were moving in slow motion, he saw the exact moment Laura placed her hand on the man's arm, as if that touch was natural. They exchanged some words that he couldn't hear. The man opened the car door for her, and she got in, without hesitation, without looking back. Daniel's heart was beating so hard that he could feel the pulse in his ears. The car started, and he couldn't move anymore. His hands were sweaty, his entire body felt trapped in a paralyzing daze. He blinked several times, as if trying to convince himself that this was an illusion, a mistake, a nightmare. But it wasn't. The car took off, taking Laura away, and Daniel remained there, frozen in time, feeling every cell in his body being consumed by the impact of what he had just witnessed. He didn't know how long he stayed there, staring into space, trying to process the pain that now overwhelmed him. The world around him seemed to go on normally, as if nothing had happened, but inside him, everything had been shattered. It was real. Laura had betrayed him. He saw it with his own eyes, without needing explanations, without needing to ask anything. He didn't need proof other than those images that would burn themselves into his mind forever. But even with the crushing pain, with the feeling of being stabbed in the chest, something inside him began to change. Anger took shape, replacing shock. If Laura thought he would accept this silently, she was wrong. If she thought she could get away with living her lie, he would make sure to show her the truth. And, at that moment, a plan began to form in his mind. He didn't know all the details yet, but he knew he wouldn't let this betrayal go unnoticed. He wouldn't beg for answers. He wouldn't ask for explanations. He would make that betrayal public in the most impactful way possible. But what he still didn't know was that betrayal was just the beginning. What was about to be revealed would change everything, in ways he could never imagine. The early morning silence was broken only by the sound of tires on the asphalt as Daniel drove aimlessly, thoughts swirling in his mind like an uncontrollable storm. Every detail of the night replayed in his head, the gestures, the looks, the car door opening for Laura, her smile before disappearing into the night. He closed his eyes for seconds, trying to push away the image, but it was embedded in his memory, impossible to erase. Pain burned in his chest like hot coals, but anger was the fuel that kept him standing. He wouldn't leave it like that. He would not be the betrayed man who retreats into silence and accepts humiliation. No. He would make Laura pay for what she did. Suddenly, the phone vibrated on the car dashboard. Her name appeared on the screen, as if fate was mocking him. He hesitated before answering, the blood pounding in his temples. He took a deep breath before sliding his finger across the screen and putting the phone on speaker. Laura's voice sounded on the other end, hesitant, cautious, as if she already knew something was wrong. She asked where he was and said that she had missed him at the party after he went out for air for a while. The lie came so naturally that it made Daniel laugh, a dry, bitter laugh, full of disbelief. He didn't respond right away, letting the silence drag on, until the tension on the other end of the line became evident. She repeated the question, and he finally broke the silence, saying only that he knew. "I knew everything." The air between them became heavy. Laura took a while to respond, and when she did, her voice wavered. He tried to deny it, tried to say that he didn't understand what he was talking about. But Daniel was no longer the same man he was a few hours ago. He didn't want empty justifications, rehearsed excuses. He told her that he had seen her, that he had watched the scene unfold before his own eyes. On the other side, a long sigh. Then, finally, the confession. She didn't try to hide it anymore. Admitted. She said she was confused, that things between them were no longer the same, that she needed something different. But none of that made sense to him. The betrayal was a blow, but what hurt him most was the coldness with which she spoke, as if the time they spent together, the memories, everything could be discarded like that, without remorse. He hung up the phone without saying anything else, because he knew that any word at that moment would be a knife stuck even deeper. But this was not the end yet. He needed more. I needed to know the complete truth. The next day, he went to her office. He didn't say he was going. He just entered, crossing the corridors with firm steps, ignoring the curious looks of the employees. Laura was in her living room, with her back to the door, looking out the window. When he heard the sound of the door closing, he quickly turned around. Her eyes widened when she saw him there, and for a second, she seemed to fear what was coming. Daniel wasted no time. He said he wanted the truth. The whole truth. He knew there was something more, something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just a betrayal. There was something bigger, something she was hiding. The hesitation on her face confirmed his suspicions. She tried to look away, tried to escape, but he wouldn't let her. He pressed, demanded answers. He said he wouldn't leave without knowing what was really happening. That's when, finally, Laura gave in. The truth came like a punch in the stomach. The man she had met that night was not just any stranger. He was someone who was part of a secret that Laura had been hiding for years. He was married. But not just that. His wife was at the party that same night. And worse. She knew about the betrayal. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The revelation was even worse than he imagined. The betrayal wasn't just against him. There was another victim in that story, someone who, like him, had been deceived, betrayed, humiliated. And all this happened under everyone's eyes, while appearances were perfectly maintained. The shock made him take a step back. He looked at Laura, trying to find something in her eyes that justified that explained it in some way, but all he found was a belated guilt, a regret that was of no use now. He couldn't believe he had been so blind. Anger bubbled in her blood, but it wasn't just for him anymore. Now, he knew there was someone on the other side of this story who deserved to know the truth just as much as he did. And at that moment, I knew exactly what I would do. He wouldn't let that go unnoticed. He wouldn't be just another silent victim. He would unmask Laura in the most painful way possible. The game was just beginning. Daniel remained there, still, feeling the weight of the revelation sink him even further. The betrayal in itself was a brutal blow, but knowing that someone else was also trapped in this web of lies made everything even more unbearable. Laura watched him, tensely, her lips slightly parted, as if searching for words that could soften the impact of what she had just confessed. But there were no words that could make it any less devastating. He clenched his fists at his sides, breathing raggedly, trying to process everything before his anger took over. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the very air had been contaminated by this sickening revelation. He took a step back, trying to get away from her presence, but her voice cut through the silence, hesitant, loaded with belated guilt. She said it wasn't something planned, that everything happened unexpectedly, that she didn't want it to be like that. But Daniel wasn't interested in empty justifications. I didn't want to hear about fake regrets or how she didn't want to hurt him. He raised his hand, telling her to shut up, and the look he gave Laura was enough to silence her. He wanted answers, yes, but not excuses. I wanted to understand where this farce was going. How did she have the courage to act that way? What went through your head every time you looked into his eyes and told him you loved him? How did she manage to share a bed with him at night, knowing that the next day she would meet another man? And worst of all, how were you able to do this to that guy's wife? How did she sleep at night knowing that an innocent woman was being deceived in the same way he was? She looked away, bit her lower lip, her hands shaking. Daniel noticed her nervousness, and this only reinforced his certainty that there was more to the story. He forced her to continue, bluntly. He said he wanted everything, every disgusting detail, because if there was anything he hated more than being cheated on, it was being made a fool of. Laura took a deep breath, her eyes moist, and began to speak. Said the other man, Marco, it was someone she had worked with for years, and things just happened. At first, it was just innocent conversations, exchanges of unimportant messages, but over time, the meetings began, the feelings intensified. But that wasn't what made Daniel feel even more disgusted. That's what came later. She said that Marco's wife already knew. He had discovered everything weeks before, but instead of confronting them, he decided to observe, gather evidence, wait for the right moment to act. She didn't want a simple fight, she didn't just want screaming and crying. She wanted something bigger. Laura swallowed hard as she said that the mysterious woman had been at the party that night, moving around the room, greeting people, smiling, while inside, she was probably burning with hatred. Daniel felt his adrenaline soar. That explained the feeling that something was wrong that night, the invisible tension that he hadn't been able to decipher. But if Marco's wife already knew, then, what was her next step? He stared at Laura, demanding to know what would happen now. She hung her head, muttering that she didn't know, that she had no idea what the woman was planning. And that was enough to make Daniel leave in a hurry, leaving Laura alone in her room, pale, not knowing what to do. He needed to find this woman. He needed to know how she intended to act. After a few discreet calls, he got a name, Clara. He had heard of her before, he knew she was a respectable woman, known for her elegant and discreet behavior. And now, this same woman was about to blow everything up. He went to her address, an apartment well located in the city, and knocked on the door, not knowing what to expect. When Clara opened it, her eyes, already filled with a darkness that had been harboring for weeks, analyzed him for a moment before she finally spoke. He said he was already waiting for him. She invited him in, and the atmosphere was different from what he imagined. I expected a place devastated by suffering, perhaps messy, as if she had broken everything in a fit of rage. But contrary to that, the place was spotless. Ordered. Silent. Clara was in control. She was direct. He said he discovered the betrayal before Marco even realized it. She found messages, photos, and started following him without him knowing. All of this happened weeks before the party. But instead of confronting him, he decided to prepare himself. I wanted to see how far he would go. Daniel asked what her plan was. Clara smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy, but something much sharper. She had already made all the arrangements. That night, while Marco thought he was getting away with it, she had already sent emails to the entire company, revealing everything. There were conversations, tryouts, incompatible schedules. And what's more, not only did it expose the lovers, but it ensured that Marco and Laura suffered professional consequences as well. Daniel felt a mix of satisfaction and shock. Clara was not a passive victim. She didn't cry in corners waiting for someone to give her crumbs of dignity. She prepared her revenge meticulously. And now, there was no going back. He asked if she felt relief in doing so. Clara looked at him deeply before responding. He said he felt more than relief. He felt like he was finally in control of his own story. Daniel watched her, realizing that this woman, who should have been torn apart, was stronger than ever. He wondered if he could do the same. If he could come out of this with his head held high, without letting the pain consume him. But he knew he still had something to do. And while Clara saw her revenge consummated, he still needed to end his own battle. He got up, thanked us for the conversation and left. His next destination was the place where he would meet Laura and Marco together for the last time. And this time, he wouldn't leave without them both understanding exactly what they lost. Daniel left Clara's building with firm steps, but inside him, everything seemed to spin in a whirlwind of emotions. The feeling that control was back in his hands was intense, but at the same time, the reality of the facts weighed on his shoulders like a chain that was difficult to drag. The truth had been exposed, the masks had fallen, but what would happen now? He was not the same man as before, and that betrayal was not a simple chapter to be overcome. It was a watershed moment. The night stretched in dark tones across the sky, and the city seemed indifferent to the chaos that consumed its mind. He drove slowly, each traffic light that closed seemed to give more time for his thoughts to organize themselves. He remembered Clara's every word, every calculated detail of her revenge. As much as she had been betrayed and humiliated, she did not lose herself in her own pain. She rose up, turned her wound into a well-aimed blow against those who deceived her. Daniel wondered if he would have done the same in her place. If he would have been able to act so coldly, with such precision. He knew he needed to face Laura one last time. There were no more secrets between them, there was no more room for cheap justifications. But for some reason, he wanted to look into her eyes and see if he could still find any trace of the woman he once loved. Or if all that was left was just the shadow of a lie. He stopped in front of the apartment where they had lived together for so many years. The building looked the same as always, the lights on in the apartments gave the feeling of a normal life happening inside, but for him, that place would never be the same again. He went up in the elevator, feeling each floor dragging, as if time was trying to give him one last chance to change his mind. But there was no going back. The door opened before he could even knock. Laura was there, her eyes red, her hair disheveled, as if she hadn't slept since the last time they saw each other. She looked at him as if she already knew what was coming, as if she no longer expected redemption. He entered without asking permission, the atmosphere was cold, impersonal. The house that was once full of memories now seemed like just an empty space. She started to speak first, her voice carried tiredness, guilt and a desperate attempt to recover something that was already dead. She said there was no excuse for what she did, that she didn't expect him to forgive her, but that she needed him to know that, at some point, it wasn't just cheating. That there were feelings, that there was confusion inside her that made her make wrong decisions. But all Daniel heard was noise. He already knew that for people like Laura, betrayal always came with justifications, with attempts to soften what they did, to transform a selfish act into a human error. But none of that mattered now. He cut her off before she continued. He said he was not there to hear explanations, nor to discuss what had already been decided. He wanted to know just one thing, if she, at some point, really thought about telling the truth, or if she would have carried that lie through to the end if she hadn't been discovered. Laura hesitated. His silence was the most honest response he could have. She would never have told. Never. And that confirmed what he already knew. The love he thought existed between them was no longer real. Maybe it never would have been. Maybe he spent years loving someone who only existed in his head, a projection of the woman he wanted to believe Laura was. But now he saw clearly. He saw the person before him, eyes asking for pity, but not for genuine repentance. Just for fear of losing everything. He turned around, ready to leave for the last time. But before he could reach the door, Laura grabbed his arm. He asked her not to leave like that, to at least consider a longer conversation, to try to understand what happened. He looked at her touch, and it was at that moment that he realized he no longer felt anything. There was no more heat, no more desire, not even anger. Just an immense void, absolute indifference. He walked away and opened the door, stopping only to say that he didn't need to understand anything else. That her actions had already said it all. And then, without looking back, he left. The street was silent, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. But it wasn't a relief. It was just acceptance that everything he knew was over. He knew there was still a long way to go, that he would still need to deal with the wreckage of what Laura had destroyed. But at that moment, he allowed himself to just keep walking, without destination, without rushing. Because he knew this story wasn't over yet. Something inside him said that the real outcome was yet to come. The sound of Daniel's footsteps echoed across the wet sidewalk as he walked leisurely, feeling the cold wind cut into his skin. The city was silent at that hour, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel suffocated. There was no longer the tension there was before, there was no longer the need to look for answers, because now everything was clear. But the clarity didn't make the pain any less, just more real. He took his phone out of his pocket and saw some missed calls from unknown numbers. Probably journalists or people who had become aware of the scandal that Clara exposed. Chaos must already be spreading, and he didn't care. What else could happen now? He had already lost what was most important to him. Nothing would surprise him anymore. When he stopped in front of Clara's building again, he hesitated for a moment before pressing the intercom. I didn't really know why I was there. Maybe because she was the only person who understood what he was feeling. Maybe because, in a way, the two were connected now. Her voice came over the intercom, slightly tired but without hesitation. She unlocked the door without asking anything. He climbed the few floors and, when he reached the apartment door, he found Clara leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem surprised to see him there. She just watched him for a moment before making room for him to enter. The atmosphere was different from last time. Some boxes were stacked near the sofa, as if she was organizing her way out of there. He looked around and realized that the apartment no longer bore so many traces of her. She broke the silence first, asking if he was okay. The question was rhetorical, and they both knew it. He gave a humorless smile and threw himself onto the sofa. Clara sat in the armchair opposite him, her eyes attentive. She asked if he had spoken to Laura, and he nodded. He told how the last conversation went, how he realized that there was nothing left between them other than a failed story. Clara listened in silence, just nodding her head from time to time. After a while, she got up and went to the kitchen. She returned with 2 glasses of wine and handed one to him. Daniel accepted it without saying anything and took a long drink. She finally said that she also had one last talk with Marco. That he tried to explain himself, tried to convince her that everything was a mistake, that he didn't want to lose his family. But she gave him no room for false promises. She said that everything had already been resolved and that he was no longer part of her life. Daniel looked at her for a moment, admiring the strength with which she handled it. He asked her if she really didn't feel anything anymore, if there wasn't a part of her that still wanted to believe Marco. Clara sighed and placed the glass on the table. I said, at first, yes. That she spent days trying to find justifications, wondering where she went wrong, if she could have done something different. But then she realized the betrayal wasn't about her. It wasn't about what she did or didn't do. It was about Marco and his choices. About Laura and her lack of character. He said he would not bear guilt for something that was never under his control. Daniel remained silent, absorbing those words. As much as I knew she was right, it was still difficult to shake the feeling that something could have been avoided. After a while, Clara got up and picked up one of the boxes next to the sofa. He said he was moving. That he didn't want to stay there, in the place where he built a life with Marco. He asked her where she was going, and she shrugged. He said he didn't know yet. Maybe another city. Maybe another country. She just wanted to go where no one would look at her with pity. Daniel understood. He also wanted to disappear for a while. The two were silent for a long moment, just drinking and watching the city through the window. It was strange how a moment of destruction could also be a moment of rebirth. After a while, Daniel got up, placed the glass on the table and said he would leave. Clara walked him to the door, and before he left, she held his arm lightly. He asked what he would do now. He didn't know how to answer. He said he hadn't thought about it yet, that he still didn't know what his next step would be. Clara smiled slightly and said that sometimes not knowing was the best place to start. Daniel left the apartment and walked slowly down the stairs, feeling that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't so lost. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he wouldn't stay still. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The days that followed were a mixture of silence and chaos. Daniel spent the first few nights staring at the ceiling of the small furnished apartment he hastily rented, feeling the weight of what had happened come crashing down on him in unpredictable waves. There were moments of anger, of disbelief, of relief. But most of all, there was the nagging feeling that I hadn't completely finished this story yet. He tried to move on, get busy with work, but Laura's name kept echoing in his mind. He didn't want anything more from her, he was sure of that, but he needed to know how her world fell apart after the truth came out. The answer came faster than I imagined. One of my office colleagues sent a message with a link to an article on a corporate news website. The scandal had spread like wildfire. Laura and Marco's involvement became public, and the company was quick to act. Both were fired. Senior management wanted to stay away from any negative headlines that could harm the company's reputation. Furthermore, with all the evidence sent by Clara, it was clear that Laura had violated business ethics clauses, which only made her departure easier. Her career, which took years to build, was destroyed in just a few days. Daniel felt no pleasure upon learning this. There was no moment of celebration, no sense of revenge completed. Just an inevitable confirmation of what he already knew: everything has a price. And Laura now paid for her choices. On the other hand, Clara had disappeared. He tried to get in touch a few times, but his messages went unanswered. Until, one morning, he received a short email, without much explanation. She said she was fine, that she had left everything behind and moved to another country. She wanted a fresh start away from anything that reminded her of Marco. He stated that, for the first time in a long time, he felt light. Daniel smiled when he read that. Clara deserved a fresh start. Marco, in turn, was in the eye of the hurricane. In addition to his dismissal, his wife immediately filed for divorce, demanding considerable compensation and leaving him without many options. With no job, no marriage, no reputation, he became just another man who destroyed his own life because of selfish impulses. Daniel learned that he tried to contact Laura a few times after everything fell apart, but she completely ignored him. The case that brought them together became the weight that sank them. Laura also disappeared from the radar for a while. He didn't answer calls, he didn't respond to messages, he didn't go to the same places. Until, a few weeks later, Daniel saw her by chance, sitting alone in a cafe. She didn't notice his presence right away. She looked distant, her hands holding a cup of tea that was cooling without being touched. There was something about her that wasn't there before. A shadow, a weight that seemed to sink her into her own guilt. He could have just walked away. He could have let her go her way without further confrontation. But something inside him compelled him to walk to his desk. Laura looked up slowly when she noticed his approach, and for the first time since the betrayal, there was no challenge in her gaze. Just tiredness. She asked if he wanted to sit down, and he did. For a few minutes, they were silent, just feeling the weight of what was left between them. Then, she spoke. He said he thought that, with time, everything would work itself out, that he would find a way to continue after everything. But it didn't happen. Every place he went, every face he met, seemed filled with the same question: how did you manage to destroy everything? Daniel listened to her without interrupting. He saw the contained tears shine in her eyes, he saw the trembling fingers holding the cup, he saw how she tried to hold on but failed. She asked if one day he could forgive her. He thought for a long moment before responding. He said that forgiveness was not something that could simply be given as a gift. It was a process, something that might take years. But most of all, he said that, in the end, forgiveness wasn't even the most important thing. The most important thing was what she would do with what was left of herself. Laura nodded, as if she had already expected that answer. After a few more minutes, he got up, put some notes on the table and said goodbye. There was nothing more to be said. He left the cafe and, for the first time, didn't look back. The months passed, and Daniel found a new path. He moved, got a new job, started meeting different people. The trauma of betrayal still existed, but it was no longer a weight he carried. He learned that starting over didn't mean erasing the past, but rather using it as a foundation to build something new. It was then that he met her. One afternoon, in a bookstore, he accidentally bumped into a woman who dropped some books on the floor. He bent down to help her, and when he looked up, he saw a genuine smile, something he hadn't seen in a long time. She thanked him, laughing at her own distraction, and he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he felt like smiling back. The past is behind us. The future was in front of him. Now it was just a matter of moving forward. And so we end this story. But now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, betrayal is never justifiable, and it always comes at a high price. Until next time.